Tonight we begin a three-part series on what I've called the Divine Feminine, as found in a number of the world's religious traditions. Tonight we're going to focus on Judaism and Islam. Next week we'll look at Christianity. And in week 3 we'll examine Hinduism and Buddhism. So you can see this is a pretty quick survey. I could do an entire semester course just on Hindu goddesses if I wanted. But so this will just be a brief introduction, and I know after this you'll go home and do your own in-depth research on Okay, but as an introduction, probably we need to define some terms. It's usually good. What do I mean by divine and what do I mean by feminine? So let's start with feminine, which again, we could do a whole course on feminist studies, but so when we discuss masculine and feminine, we're looking at a universal cultural opposition based both on biology, that is physical structure, and or social role and associated qualities. Now, nearly all cultures make this distinction in some form. Distinction between masculine and feminine. It should be noted, however, that these distinctions have most often been the creations of men. So it's always important to recognize that males traditionally, historically, in nearly all cultures have made these basic definitions. So, biological distinctions associated with genital formation and reproduction. Masculine being related to penis, scrotum, testes, sperm production. Feminine being related to uterus, vagina, ovaries, and childbearing. This is just physical now. This is what we call a sexual distinction, as opposed to a gender distinction, which has become very important in the West. When I grew up, I didn't know the difference between sex and gender. Did you? Or did anyone make that distinction? No. Okay. So those are the biological. Social role distinctions refer to those activities within a group or groups that have been assigned to masculinity and femininity, which for the most part have historically been distinguished between domestic and public space. The feminine has tended to have more dominance in the household, the domestic space, whereas public space has been dominated by males. And what's in public space? Political power for the group. Okay. Not always the case in variations, but I think you can make a general distinction until fairly recently in the West. But just about everywhere else, and even in the West, for a long time, that was the main distinction. Feminine being assigned to prominence in the home, masculine in the political and economic spheres, traditionally. Thus, the feminine became primarily associated with sexuality, child-rearing, home-keeping tasks, and this is what's important, the various personality traits often associated with those. And that's where we get to the idea of gender. You might have feminine sexual organs, but feel you are male in terms of your identity with either the social roles, or certain personality traits. Okay? So a person can say, I'm feminine, I have a female structure, but male gender. And that's where we've seen sort of problems, because how do you put those two together? Now that's only something that's really happened in the West. It's starting to happen more often but traditionally, the social roles in most cultures have been pretty well defined until we get to modernity, when everything goes crazy, right? Okay. And like today in the contemporary West, these things have all been challenged. You may have noticed the whole issue of sexuality, gender, identity seems quite confusing at the moment. You might be asked if you go to certain places, what are your pronouns? Have you heard that question? Is it? Yeah. I was asked that at a school that I went to teach at, where everyone had to go around and give their pronouns, whether it's I, we, they. I said it's us. Didn't go over real well, but okay. So that's basic masculine-feminine distinction. What about the word divine? If I say the word divine, and don't tell me Andy divine, what comes to mind to you if I say divine? God. Heavenly. I'll use it in terms of referring to what I call the transcendent. The transcendent, which has been an essential component of religious categories throughout human history. All religions have their notion of the transcendent. And here, transcendent means beyond the everyday phenomenal world of sensory experience. The belief that there's a reality just beyond what we're experiencing here. It's transcendent, beyond. And usually this level of existence is seen to have either greater power or goodness compared to the human realm. Right? So the transcendent is that which is beyond what we call sensory, everyday, common sense experience. Is there a transcendent? I don't know. A lot of people have believed it, and most religions are founded upon it. They may call it God, they may call it Allah, they may call it Buddha nature, but it's something that goes beyond just what we're experiencing here, especially beyond just sensory experience. Okay? This distinction in terms of the history of religion is usually referred to as the difference between the profane and the sacred. The sacred is that which is beyond the profane world. So when I'm speaking of the divine feminine, we're going to be looking at the various ways religions have projected their notions of the feminine onto the transcendent. Okay. You have your social understanding of masculine, feminine. Okay. What religions do is then take those roles, identities, and project them out into the cosmos or the transcendent. So it's the difference between a beautiful woman and a goddess. A goddess has that aspect of the transcendent. But what you'll see is your notion of femininity in any culture is there, and then it's transcended, projected onto the transcendent. Do you understand what I'm trying to say there? Yep. We have our notions of masculine and feminine, but then what do we do if we project them onto the divine? So that's what we're going to be looking at, and we're going to be starting tonight with Judaism and Islam. So let's start with Judaism. When one thinks of traditional Judaism, if anyone's ever done any study, the idea of the divine feminine seems kind of foreign. A lot of people think, is there really a divine feminine in Judaism? God, or Yahweh, while theoretically beyond all description, tends to take on a masculine persona. How's in the Hebrew Bible? What's the pronoun? He. So there tends to be this idea of God as being somehow masculine. And usually, if you read the what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, it's contrasted with the idol worship of mother goddesses of foreign cultures, especially the Canaanites. The Canaanites worship mother goddesses. So we tend to think of Judaism as a masculine projection onto the transcendent. So we find, for example, the prophet Jeremiah speaking of his and God's displeasure at the behavior of the Hebrew people, some of whom are worshiping goddesses. got to remember that early on, this notion of strict monotheism that we find in Judaism, before the Babylonian captivity, early on, there was quite a mixture. Why is he complaining? You don't complain unless these things are going on. But by the time of the Talmud, and now we're moving forth into like the 3rd and 5th centuries. This is after the temple has been destroyed, after Jews have gone into Eastern Europe, etc. And the Talmud appears, and the Talmud are commentaries on Scripture. So by this time, the time of the Talmud, we find references to the divine feminine, and they begin to appear. And they're related to a certain interpretation given to a term used frequently in Scripture, namely the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah. What is the Shekhinah? Has anyone ever heard of the Shekhinah? Probably not. Probably not. It means literally dwelling or settling in, and was used to denote the dwelling or presence of God in the temple. So there was Yahweh or God, but the presence of God was referred to as Shekhinah. And the prophets made numerous references to metaphorical visions of this Shekhinah. Ezekiel spoke of the glory of the Shekhinah of God in the sanctuary. In the Talmud, it is said that the Shekhinah is what caused David to compose his Psalms. And that Shekhinah continually manifests herself as a form of joy and creativity. Most significantly, Shekhinah is grammatically feminine, which led certain scholars and medieval mystics to hold that the Shekhinah represented the feminine attributes of the presence of God. Subtle distinction there. Not the feminine attributes of God, but of the presence of God. Because that's what Shekhinah means. The presence, when something is present, when it comes into being, when it comes into the sanctuary. So God's presence is feminine.
What's the difference
Between
the presence of God and God?
You can't, okay, it's kind of subtle, but you can't say anything ultimately about God. You can't even name God. But God's presence, which is kind of an abstract thing, right? I mean, that can be referred to, and it's referred to as feminine. Now, okay, we'll carry on with this. I find it fascinating. Who's going to really focus on these are the mystics. The mystics will pick up this trend, and we'll get there in a moment. So Rabbi Ezra and Yehuda would claim the following. Prayer is God's partner. Prayer. See, prayer is presence, isn't it? Prayer is the presence of the Word. She sits on the left side like a bride, and he is her bridegroom. And she is called Shekhinah, daughter of the king. Some scholars even spoke of Shekhinah fleeing the sanctuary when the Temple of Solomon was destroyed. The Temple of Solomon was destroyed by the Assyrians. And there was reference that her presence was in the temple, and when it was destroyed, she fled, retiring to heaven and calling out, I will return to my place, heaven, until the people admit their guilt and seek my face. I find that fascinating. It is this context she's sometimes called the divine bride. the divine bride. But it was in the rise of Jewish mysticism. When I did my series on mysticism, you may remember I talked about the Kabbalah, or the Jewish mysticism. It's during the rise of Jewish mysticism that the divine feminine really began to take on a prominent role in Jewish thought. So let us now turn to this phenomena. Kabbalah means receiving. It's a discipline and school of thought concerned with what in religious terms we call the esoteric, and all that means is hidden, the hidden aspects of rabbinic Judaism. So what might that mean if something is hidden? Let's take the text. Let's take the old the Hebrew Bible. If something's hidden within that text, you're probably not going to be wanting to read the text how? Literally. It's hidden. It's in deeper meaning of the text. This is what the Kabbalists, this is what the Sufis, this is what the Christian mystics all do. They look at the text and they find hidden underlying meanings. And according to this approach, this is where the Kabbalists see a great deal of emphasis on the feminine. This Kabbalah was systematized in the 11th to 13th centuries, southern France and Spain, and then again in the 16th century in Ottoman Palestine. This is where the great revival of mystical thinking took place. In the 18th century, and we'll get there at the end, it was popularized in what is known as Hasidic Judaism. And I'll say more about that in a bit. So, Kabbalah was concerned to explain, or wanted to explain, the relationship between an eternal and mysterious creator who could not even be named and mortal final universe. The relationship between this majestic, unknown, mysterious, unnamed creator and all this, what we call creation. What's the relationship between this? How do these fit? That's what they're interested in. It sought to define the nature of the universe, the human condition, and the purpose of human existence. And it presented methods to aid in the understanding of these concepts and thereby help attain spiritual realization. So the goal of the Kabbalah or any of the mystics in the end is spiritual realization. Religion, religion, reconnection. The connection between this mysterious creator. You can't even call it creator. You can't use any words. And the creation. That's what it's trying to do, to bring those two together. Religion is about connection. That's what it's really about. The attempt to connect the micro with the macro. Okay? And all the various religions have all their ways of trying to do that. But that's the aim. Religio, reconnection. So, the Kabbalistic scheme, God is neither matter nor spirit, but the creator of both. You can't really say anything about God. He's unknowable in his own essence. But then there's the revealed aspect. There's his creation. Kabbalists called the first Ein Sof. And then the second, they speak of the emanations. So somehow, in some mysterious way, which even scientists can't explain, out of nothing, out of comes something. If you ask a scientist what happened before the Big Bang, and I ask Jerry all the time, he will say, that's an improper question. You can't ask that question because there is no time. So, and that's kind of mysterious, isn't it? When you really think about it. Where all of this, it all came out as what? The unknowable Ein Sof. We can't know anything, the Kabbalists say, about Ein Sof, about the ultimate. What we can know are about the emanations. We can know about what God has created at various levels, especially attributes, justice, mercy, love, compassion. And I don't know if you can count them here, but they're known as, there's 10 major emanations that come out of the Ein Sof. Creation can't know the Creator, but it can know the Creator's emanations. Does that make sense? We can't know God, but we can know justice. We can't know God, but we can know mercy. And that's the idea. And it's in relationship to these emanations that the divine feminine gains significance in Kabbalistic thought. For man's soul is believed to incorporate both masculine and feminine emanations. We all have within us both. Now that's, and you know where where the Kabbalists got this from? Genesis 1:27. Can anyone repeat that for me? If Albert was here, he could. Listen closely. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him male and female. He created them. Suddenly we get a switch, that's it, to a plural. The Kabbalists took this to mean male and female are not distinct, separate emanations. They are attributes of man's soul. And I see, this is the language problem. And when I say man, we tend to think of the masculine, of the human soul. Let me put it that way. All human souls have masculine and feminine within them. And notice it said, he created man in his own image. So God must have masculine and feminine attributes or emanations. So, corresponding to the last emanation is the indwelling Shekhinah. Every human being has the indwelling holy presence of the Shekhinah. It's in every human being. But the Shekhinah tends to be what? Exiled. Exiled culturally, exiled historically. And remember the great symbol of her being exiled from the temple and leaving. So for the Kabbalists, the goal is the reunification of masculine and feminine. To bring back the Shekhinah within the human soul. And it fits in with, really interestingly, with their story of creation called Tikkun Olam, which means repair of the world. In the Kabbalistic notion of creation, God is creating, all the emanations are coming out, they're beautiful vessels filled with love, justice, and then they shatter. Why? No one knows. They do. They shatter. And the role of a good Jew, and especially, and this could be extended to all human beings, is to repair that shattering. That's why we exist, to repair the world. And part of that repair internally is bringing back the reconciliation of masculine and feminine. So in working out this process, they placed great importance on what they called the exile of the Shekhinah and the need to reincorporate her into the divine life. Her exile became a metaphor for all forms of disharmony that affect humanity. Why is there disharmony? Because of the lack of the Shekhinah, who has been exiled. In repetitive examples, the Kabbalah speaks of negative divisions between masculine and feminine, which need to be overcome to enhance what they call the tree of life. To this end, an entire systematic explanation of that tree emerged, which, much like, if you know, yin and yang in Chinese thought, expressed the masculine as primarily generative and the feminine as essentially receptive. That's probably a medieval male division, okay? But it did place great emphasis on bringing the feminine back into reality, socially, individually, religiously. One of the branches is, which is known as the Bina, or the great womb, the treasure house of souls, is also the power of speech, sound, and understanding. Without speech, without sound, without understanding, you're not going to have knowledge. So the feminine is, the Shekhinah is related to knowledge as well. So, the Kabbalists were rather elitists. And these were mystics who were trained deeply in understanding Scripture, etc. But in the 18th century, we get a more popular form of religious expression which deals with the Shekhinah. And this is what's known as Hasidism. It emerged, like I said, in the 18th century. Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov. And he formed it as a reaction against the overly intellectual and legalistic Judaism of his time. What was lacking, according to Tov? Emotion. If you're just reading the Scripture and intellectually describing it, that's one thing. But to experience it emotionally was another. So he began to introduce this, and the Shekhinah played a great role because she became the presence of song, dance, and storytelling. So you'd have communal gatherings with ecstatic experience. Do you know what I mean by ecstatic? So remember we had the whirling dervishes, the Hare Krishna. You're no longer meditating silently within. You're ecstatically joyful. You're singing. You're dancing. And this was seen as the presence of the Shekhinah. So they would welcome her in, and they called her the Shabbat Bride. Does everyone know what Shabbat is? Shabbat is, we get Sabbath from that. That's the whole Jewish holy day of Shabbat. She became known as the Sabbath Bride, whose sovereignty over the earth was acknowledged by refraining from the 39 categories of work. On Shabbat, you're not supposed to do, the more orthodox you are, the less you can do. But traditionally, that was a day of what? Rest. You did nothing. That was the Lord's day. But this, for the Hasidus, it's her day. When she comes into the Sabbath, that's why you don't do any work. You're honoring her as the bride, sometimes called the Bride of Jerusalem or the Shabbat Queen. And they would have great ceremonies where they would sing and dance and lead her from her earthly kingdom into her transcendent kingdom. Just as she had sort of left the temple at one point and comes back, this becomes a ceremony or a ritual where you're guiding her away into the transcendent, from which she will always return. I don't know if you remember this this Kabbalistic mystic Isaac Luria. But this is what he wrote in terms of bridal imagery from the 16th century. It's one of his famous hymns. I sing in hymns to enter the gates of the field of holy apples. A new table we prepare for her. A lovely candelabrum sheds its light upon us. Between right and left, the bride approaches in holy jewels and festive garments. This is the return of the feminine. So this, just quickly to mention some actually historical stuff. As a result, Hasidism produced a number of famous female teachers and saints. And this is one of the most famous. Her name is Hannah Rachel, 1805 to 1888. She had a near-death experience while praying at her mother's grave as a teenager. And she decided to take on the traditional male role of studying the Torah and the Talmud. She could do it within the Hasidic tradition. Other traditions would say no. But this is, I think, an example of how this could actually be not just abstract, but brought into the community. Women allowed to do this. Okay, so any question? We're going to go to Islam next. Any questions? Do you get the sort of the idea here that there is this hidden notion within Jewish thought of the feminine? It's usually not found in Orthodox teachings, but you can find it with the mystics. If you look hard enough, you can find it, and it's called the Shekhinah, the feminine presence. The feminine presence of the divine.
Would this be taught in an ordinary Jewish synagogue?
Not Orthodox. Rabbi Mike would. Do you know Rabbi Mike, the Reform rabbi? I've talked to Rabbi Mike about this. Yeah, he's Reform would include this. Orthodox, probably not.
It doesn't sound like it's really such a bad role.
No, it's not. It's not a bad role. But, males are all fearful of females getting power for some reason. These things tend to be pushed back. There's the fear. I call it the fear of the feminine. And I think
there is the fear of the feminine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they're saying that she's present, but I don't sense that she's powerful. And certainly in Orthodox Judaism.
No, she's not powerful. No, she's not powerful in any overt sense. That's true. She's powerful in this sort of mystical sense. Okay, let's turn to Islam. And as within traditional Judaism, the divine feminine is often seen to be either non-existent or extremely marginalized, no doubt as a result of the over-patriarchal culture that dominated 7th century Arabia. Islam came out of 7th century Arabia. You've got to always put something into its historical and cultural context. It was a very patriarchal, male-dominated society. But as Islam spread, it took on its mystical wing, which we talked about in previous classes, known as Sufism. So when we're looking for expressions of the divine feminine in Islam, it should not surprise us that they're going to be found primarily in the world of Islamic mysticism. So as we saw when we looked at Sufism earlier, the chief aim of all Sufis is to restore within themselves the primordial state of what is known as fitra, or the complete love of God and unity with God. Again, religio, connection. That's what the Sufi wants more than anything else. Connection with the ultimate, which in Islam is referred to as Allah. But to do that, you have to abandon all notions of dualism. What's dualism? Opposites. A, B, either or. Now, do you see what that can lead into? Because what's one of the dominant cultural oppositions? Male, female. So if you want to have ultimate union with Allah, you can't have any dualistic notions within yourself. So in this regard, many Sufi schools identify the higher states of the soul with the esoteric or hidden meanings of the Quran. Just as the Jewish mystics saw hidden meanings in the Hebrew Bible, so Sufis will look for, and why? See, they're going to be challenged. If you ever live in an Orthodox religious society, someone's going to always challenge you, and it happens here all the time. Is that in the Bible? Is that in the text? Okay. So they have to have an answer to that. So what they have is, yes, it's in the text, but it's not going to be there literally. It's going to be hidden or esoteric. And one of the things, this is a good example of a Sufi interpretation of the opening surah of the Quran. Surah is the chapter. It's the opening verses of the Quran that is recited by millions of Muslims every day, where Allah is called Al-Rahim, the all-compassionate and merciful. Rahim derives from the Arabic word for womb, W-O-M-E. A womb is what? Feminine. And therefore, mercy and compassion are seen as the feminine attributes of the divine. Now again, males are making these distinctions, but they're at least being acknowledged. There are feminine attributes of the divine. And the Sufis understood them as a counterbalance to the numerous Quranic references to Allah's righteous anger. And there's a lot of those too, just as you find in the Bible, right? So this was the counterbalance. On the one hand, Allah has anger because he stands for justice and he sees unrighteousness. But on the other hand, as every surah of the Quran says, he's compassionate and merciful. That's always, to me, a nice little thing. Every surah begins the same way. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Then it may go on to tell you how angry he is. But that's, and the Sufis saw this as the feminine attribute. They also see that the Quran's compassion is illustrated in the numerous references to Mary, the mother of Jesus. She's mentioned more in the Quran, actually, than she is in the New Testament. She is considered the most marvelous of all women, her virginity symbolizing not only her purity, but mainly her embodiment of compassion. As a result, in numerous Sufi traditions, she is seen as the supreme example of selflessness. And for a Sufi, selflessness is the path to Allah. Getting rid of the ego. As long as you've got the ego as number one, well, that's it. You're number one. This culture sort of thrives in that notion, right? Be number one. Be number one. In any case, one tradition says that when Muhammad entered the Kaaba in Mecca to clean it of images, he left one of Mary and Jesus. Whether that's true or not, it's a standing tradition. Another states, he claimed, paradise is at the feet of mothers. Paradise is at the feet of mothers, which many Sufis took to mean that the feminine qualities were the gateways to the presence of God. Now again, these gender qualities are defined by culture. We're in the process of trying to redefine all these things. What does it mean for something to be a feminine quality? You know, if you ask that today, you probably get 40 different answers. Is there such a thing as a feminine quality? Or are these culturally derived? What is it? What are masculine? Well, we know, I know what I grew up with, you know, what were masculine qualities and what were feminine qualities. But that's becoming sort of all mixed up right now, which may well be a good thing. So one of the Sufi tropes, and a trope is a sort of a systematic way of stating something, related to the divine feminine as being the main part of the human soul. Just like the Kabbalists. The human soul is feminine. And we'll see this in Hinduism. Krishna is the male god. The gopis are the females, which are human souls. Because the masculine and the feminine have to unite. The masculine and the feminine have to unite. So you often find in Sufi poetry, the soul becomes the symbol of the lover of the divine path. And there's no better poet in expressing that than the great Turkish Persian mystical poet Rumi, which I believe we discussed when we were discussing Sufism last time. He would proclaim, wherever you are, and in whatever circumstances you find yourself, try to be a lover, and a passionate lover. Once your heart is possessed by love, you will remain a lover always. In the tomb, on the day of resurrection, in paradise and forever. The path of love. And if the human soul is feminine and Allah is masculine, it's the unity of those two. It's the unity of those two. For Rumi, the feminine quality of the soul was often represented in terms of relationship to the spirit. So the soul, there's the soul, and then there's the spirit. So a human being has a soul and spirit. Rumi said the soul is feminine, the spirit is masculine. The goal is to bring the two together through love. So the spirit tends to represent more of the intellectual, the reason. The soul is the emotive notion of connection. The two together are needed for ideal love. If you don't have reason, you're likely to go off the path completely, right? I mean, if you just go into some emotive experience and you call it love, and there's no reason behind it, it's just sort of, well, that's probably going to end in a bit of disaster. And if the relationship is solely reason, solely rational, solely mechanical, it won't hold either. The ideal is to bring the two together. Emotion, reason. In this respect, the spirit was often called the husband and the soul the wife. So we each have within us the husband and the wife. And the goal is to bring the two together. When the two marry, like Adam and Eve, they make up the earth of the body and they make it fruitful, Rumi says. And bring about the possibility, now this is good, of the return to the primordial unity from which they arose. Originally, they're one. In the beginning, God created them in his own image. Then they part, which might be the story of the Garden of Eden to some degree. The goal is to bring them back together. That's the religious goal. Reunification. Getting back to who we really are. Another powerful image used by Rumi to represent the soul was that of the mirror, which is capable of reflecting the luminosity of the spiritual realm. You find the mirror is a very powerful religious symbol in many religions. Japan is one of the great examples. What does a mirror do? It reflects the other reality. The cleaner the mirror, the more real the reflection. A dusty, dirty mirror, well, okay. So we're all, in a sense, we're all mirrors. We should be mirroring the divine emanations if we go. But our mirrors become what? Dusty, dirty. We don't clean them. And then things get all messed up. Okay. So, drawing on the Quran's admiration for Mary, Rumi and other Sufis often compared the soul of the Virgin Mary, the soul as Virgin Mary, while Jesus is the heart to which she gives birth. She gives birth to the heart of Jesus. Yeah, people don't recognize just how much devotion and praise and glory is given in the Quran to both Jesus and Mary. You would never find anyone putting down Jesus or Mary. It just doesn't happen. Jesus is a prophet. Mary is the compassionate mother of God, according to the Quran. Whereas you look at how images of Islam are often portrayed. Yeah, it's a big difference, big difference. So, and the goal is the perfected heart. None other than the transcendence of the masculine-feminine dualism will do. We have to get beyond the masculine-feminine dualism, bring them together to act as a whole. This is all Rumi. If you read his poetry, you'll see these themes time and again. So besides Rumi, another great Sufi mystic, and I think I discussed him also when we spoke about Sufism, who really brings out the divine feminine, is Ibn Arabi. His theological training took place in Seville in 578. So he was Spanish, a Spanish mystic, which was then the cultural and civilized center of Muslim Iberia. This was the great flowering of Islamic culture in Spain prior to the reemergence of Christian domination. I think I mentioned in our other class that at the age of 28, he had a series of mystical visions. He then traveled throughout the Muslim world, coming into contact with many Sufis. At the end of his long journey, he arrived in what's the goal of every Muslim journey eventually? Mecca. It was in Mecca that love for the feminine was first evoked in his heart. And it was initially by an ordinary, beautiful woman. Not just some... Initially, her name was Nizam, who then became the personification of what he saw as wisdom and beauty. She was the daughter of a famous Meccan sheikh, and upon meeting her, Ibn Arabi felt his spirit transformed. So, he's falling in love. But she's taken. So, Okay, but what does he keep from that relationship? That image of what it evoked in him. Okay? So sometime after the meeting, he was circumambulating the Kaaba, which is part of the great tradition of pilgrimage where you go around and around the Kaaba, which is in the center of the great mosque there in Mecca. It's a little box. It's not very big. You can see it, a black box. He was circumambulating it. When a vision of a female appeared to him and divulged the religion of love, as he called it, he experienced her as the divine Sophia, who was the goddess of Greek Gnostic wisdom. So he's had a relationship, not a relationship, but he had an experience in the flesh of perhaps falling in love, but that's beyond the boundary of his social connection at the time. Now he has a vision of the female presence. And he calls her Sophia. He was invited by what he called the veiled angel to enter the Kaaba, to go inside. Enter with me into the Kaaba, for that is the temple that arises above all veils and coverings. When you think of Islam, you think of the veil, right? And what is one of the functions of the veil? To hide the face, or to hide something, which we tend to think of negatively. But can you think of a positive understanding of the veil, not just for women, but the use of a veil?
The hidden.
The hidden. Yeah. There is the hidden beneath the veil. And what's really interesting, if you look at colonial experience in the Middle East, what was really considered erotic? The veil. Yeah. Our notion of the erotic is nothing. Okay? Just the veil, because what is if something is hidden, what does it do to your psyche? So anyway. Now, he's not speaking in a physical sense here. He's speaking in a spiritual sense. So this experience led his later reflections and recordings and writing of what he referred to as the creative feminine. The creative power of Allah, he saw, was feminine. Creativity is feminine. He points out that all Arabic terms indicating origin or cause are feminine. Grammatically, they're feminine. So all terms that refer to the origin of something or the cause of something, it's a feminine word. And that's probably not by chance. Indeed, the origin or source of anything is designated by the word mother. A linguistic fact that discloses a higher metaphysical reality. That's that projection onto the transcendent. The famous Islamist Henri Corbin, who's written profoundly about Ibn Arabi, said this about Arabi. We may say that from Arabi's perspective, essential reality, the essence of being, Allah, beyond which nothing is thinkable, we can say it's the father of all things. But it is no less fitting, at least in Arabi's works, indeed it is still more fitting to say it is their mother. Because in accordance with the connotation of its name, which is feminine, it combines action and passion, which also signifies that it also gives balance and harmony between the manifest and the hidden. So Arabi could refer to Allah as both masculine and feminine, which got him in some trouble. You can imagine. Okay? He had to flee and ended up finally in Damascus. He concludes, this is from him, whatever may be the philosophical doctrine to which we adhere, we observe as soon as we speculate on the origin and the cause, the presence of the feminine. The masculine is placed between two feminines. Adam is placed between the divine essence from which he issues and Eve, who issues from him. Divine presence, divine creative, feminine. Masculine, feminine. And thus access to true knowledge is through the medium of love, which brings the two together. And this is the goal of every mystic's heart, to bring the two together, to unify yourself, which means to unify your masculine and feminine qualities. Because if you don't, then you'll be out of balance. You'll be out of balance. So this is what he wrote, a few words. He's writing to Sophia. Now, is he really writing to Nizam? Who knows? But he says, dearly beloved, let us go toward union. And if we find the road that leads to separation, let us go hand in hand and abandon it. Abandon separation. Let us enter the presence of truth. Let it be our judge and imprinted seal upon our union forever. So he's talking to his beloved, who at this point is an abstraction. Okay, the last thing I want to mention, because this always comes up when I talk about the feminine Islam. What about the virgins? What about the 70 virgins? How many, before a few years ago, how many people even knew that? How did that come into popular discussion? Does anyone remember?
Terrorists.
Yeah, terrorists being certain fundamentalist readings of not the Quran, but of tradition, saying that the martyrs, terrorist martyrs, would be rewarded with 70 virgins in paradise. Okay. Let's look at that a little closer. Virgins are referred to in the Quran. They're known as Uri, H-O-U-R-I. And the best translation for that is splendid companions. Splendid companions, lovely-eyed and with modest gaze. That's what an Uri is. The Uri are mentioned in several places in the Quran, although there are no specific numbers given about numbers. It does not appear from the Quran that only females should be available. Companions will be available for women as well. So and I'll read the passage, all faith-keeping Muslims will be given lovely companions in paradise. Here's the passage. Those who deserve bliss will be in bliss. Then there is the elite of the elite. They are those who will be closest to Allah. In the gardens of bliss, on luxurious furnishings, enjoying everything, they will be neighbors. Serving them will be immortal servants with cups, pitchers, and pure drinks. Remember, Arabia is a desert. So if you're going to have paradise, you're probably going to have an oasis sort of scene like this. They never run out, nor do they get bored. Fruits of their choice. Now, beautiful mates, like protected pearls, rewards for their works. They never hear any nonsense nor sinful utterances, only the utterance peace, peace. In lush orchards, fragrant fruits, extended shade, abundant water, we create for them mates, virgins, never previously touched, perfectly matched. Okay, a couple comments here. If I were to ask you for a better metaphor for paradise, would you choose harps or beautiful companions?
Well, I think their description makes them sound like their children.
Yeah, they're actually,
I mean, that first sentence you said about starry out, something about their innocence.
yeah, their innocence.
It makes them sound like their children.
See, when I say the word virgin, what generally comes into most people's mind? Sex. What if I say Virgin Mary?
Right.
Purity. So, what if we say, yes, you're offered 70 Virgin Marys in paradise? And it's pretty clear from reading the Quran through. This is what's being referred to. Pure beings, spiritual beings, not lustful. So it's really a classic example of fundamentalist misreading of text, and not even Quran. It's of a tradition, a hadith tradition, which is being used in a very unfortunate way. Virgin in Islamic terminology means purity. That's why they put so much emphasis on Mary. She's pure. Not that she's lustful and that you're going to be rewarded with her in bed. Okay? You're going to be rewarded with her purity in a companionship of friends in a garden. And these are images of whatever this transcendent notion is. But I always feel the need to say this because so many people think that this notion of that Islamic terrorists are going to be given free sexual reign in paradise. No, it's not there. Okay, that sort of takes us to the end of tonight's class. Next week, we're going to turn to Christianity, and we're going to really, really, really focus on Mary, especially the Catholic Mary, and all the aspects that go along with her image, as well as a few saints at the end. Okay? So, any questions, comments, thoughts?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because you referred a lot to sort of like the union of the masculine and the feminine. Is there much in the literature that addresses homosexuality? And, because Nick always, in ancient Greek or in Roman, homosexuality was more accepted.
And it was actually quite accepted in the Islamic world too. What wasn't accepted was the abuse of young boys. There was a distinction made between, and a lot of that happened, where powerful men buying young boys to use sexually. That's out. But the notion of love, especially if you get away from sexual identity based on organs. If it's love of the masculine and feminine, that can be between any two souls. So the Sufis would, but the traditional and the traditional Islamic world is very anti-homosexual.
And the ancient world was as well.
I think that the ancient world was much more open to sexuality. I think even these notions of sexual identity have really been hardened in modernity. But what was opposed in the Quran was the abuse of young boys. Any other thoughts, questions?
Just
Clarissa?
Just a comment about, I think young people today see roles differently than, say, their grandparents did. And when it comes to child raising, nurturing and caring, I think both want to be nurturing and caring. As far as decision making, they both have those qualities. As far as household chores, and I think it's a healthy one.
Yeah, that's where the question of gender, right?
But the new feminists, the modern feminists, have really been a gift to men as
Absolutely,
well.
absolutely.
That men could participate and be a part of,
Of the home. It wasn't solely a woman's domain.
When we were first in Australia, we lived in a small town, and Chris got a job, and I didn't have one. So we had our 1-year-old son, Todd, and he's 52 today. So I would take care of him. I'd hang the nappies out on the line. I'd walk, and the Australians are there. These Americans are really different. But yeah, well, okay. So next week again, we're going to look at Christianity. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.